standardizing the administration, data collection, scoring. This is something that is so fundamental. And if it's not done well, there's nothing we can do post, after the fact to fix it and save the data that was collected. So that is something that it sounds so boring and basic, but that is like the most important thing, actually. And I also really appreciate, although it's not something that we really focus on maybe in a clinical trial setting, I do really appreciate the idea of continuity and going from having the similar or same measure go from clinical trials. I like the idea of having something that's usable in clinical trials and it meets those standards, and then keep using it in clinical practice instead of, we always think the other way around, but I actually really like that idea. Why lower the bar? And that really would help go from a place of like, okay, we've shown, we think this drug works. And then it's like, okay, now doctors, here, you can help figure out if this is working for patients as you monitor them using the same measure. And I'll just leave it with that. I do think that a higher level of evidence is generally needed for efficacy to pick up on potentially small, but maybe really meaningful changes.
Thank you so much, Marion. I want to thank our panelists for this discussion. Obviously, we could spend more time on it, but we now need to transition to our second hot topic. So I'll ask our panelists to turn off their videos for the next few minutes. And Marion is now going to be providing a presentation on age-corrected standardized scores or age norm scores. And she will do a much better job explaining this than I ever can. And so I turn it over to you, Marion.
Thank you, Michelle. So good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for staying on for the last topic in the last session. I'm going to kick off this second topic, when to consider age norm scores, with a brief presentation aimed at providing some context for the panel discussion. Next slide. Let's begin by defining the topic for our discussion. Age norm scores are scores that are adjusted for the patient's chronological age at the time of assessment. For example, suppose we administer a performance-based measure of oral expressive language development to an individual patient. The patient's raw or non-norm score indicates the individual's level of oral expressive language development. In contrast, the corresponding age norm score indicates the individual's level of oral expressive language development relative to the individual's same aged peers in the reference population. For many measures used in clinical trials, the reference population is the general US population, or typically developing individuals in the US population. In clinical practice, age norm scores can be very useful for understanding individual development or functioning relative to one's same age peers in the reference population. For example, this information can be used to help determine whether further clinical evaluation or therapeutic intervention is needed, or when defining baseline symptom severity in a study eligibility criteria. However, because the behavior skills and abilities associated with typical development and functioning change with chronological age, age norm scores from different normative age groups that are numerically equivalent actually imply different levels of development. So because of this, age norm scores have limited utility when used to evaluate efficacy in clinical trials when scores are directly compared in analyses and patients age out of one normative age group and into another over the course of a trial, and/or patients belong to different normative age groups and treatment arms are imperfectly imbalanced with respect to normative age groups. Sample sizes are insufficiently large, both overall and within each normative age group, and/or the trial sample does not include a representative set of normative age groups. Let's go through a worked example together to help illustrate these considerations. Continuing with the example introduced on slide 2, suppose we administer the performance-based measure of oral expressive language development to a 3-year-old and a 4-year-old, and then we compute their raw scores. Suppose that a higher raw score reflects a higher level of oral expressive language development, and that the reference population is comprised of typically developing individuals in the US population. For children in the US population who are typically developing in terms of their oral expressive language skills, on average, 4-year-olds are further developed than 3-year-olds. This is because oral expressive language behavior skills and abilities associated with typical development change with chronological age. Variability in level of oral expressive language development decreases as typically developing children in the US age from 3 to 4 years. Of the 2 children being evaluated in this example, the 4-year-old has a higher level of oral expressive language development than the 3-year-old. Both children are 1 standard deviation above average relative to their same age peers. As such, they have the same age norm score of 1 and the same transformed age norm score of 115. Note that age norming scores often involves a final cosmetic step of putting the age-adjusted scores on a metric that is considered to be more palatable to end users, such as patients, caregivers, and their healthcare providers. In this example, the age norm scores are transformed to have a mean of 100 and a standard deviation of 15. In an analysis of the age norm scores, the 3-year-old and the 4-year-old would be treated as though their levels of expressive language development are the same when they aren't. And this is because age norm scores from different normative age groups that are numerically equivalent imply different levels of development. There are 2 additional considerations when using age norm scores to quantify treatment effects in clinical trials. First, age-specific variability in raw scores changes the apparent treatment effect quantified by age norm scores. For example, if the 3-year-old and 4-year-old from our earlier example both experienced the same treatment benefit, the same increase in raw score, the treatment would appear to be less efficacious for the 3-year-old because there is more variability among typically developing 3-year-olds than 4-year-olds in the US population. Second, because of differences among normative age groups and raw score distribution, aging out of one normative age group and into another can alter apparent treatment effects quantified by age norm scores. For example, suppose the 3-year-old from our continued example experiences a raw score increase indicating a treatment benefit and also turns 4 during the trial. Their baseline score is normed with respect to 3-year-olds, while the end of study score is normed with respect to 4-year-olds. Recall that the 4-year-old normative group has a higher raw score mean and less variability than the 3-year-old normative age group. As such, using age norm scores, the 3-year-old appears to have actually declined rather than improved on treatment. So in summary, because age norm scores from different normative age groups cannot be directly compared, age norm scores have limited utility for quantifying treatment effects in clinical trials when those scores are analyzed continuously and patients age out of one normative age group and into another over the course of a trial, and/or patients belong to different normative age groups. And at any point during the trial, treatment arms are imperfectly balanced with respect to normative age group. Patients age out of their respective normative age group at baseline. Sample sizes are insufficiently large, both overall and within each normative age group, and/or the trial sample does not include a representative set of normative age groups to support inferences about treatment effects relative to patients' same age peers.
Thank you, Marian, for that really great presentation and some case examples, theoretical examples. I hope our audience found that very informative because just thinking about the utility of using these type of scores, it takes a lot of complex understanding of the underpinnings that actually create those scores. So I really appreciate you taking some time to try to explain all of that in such a short period of time, but I think that was a really great explanation. I want to thank you for that. So I want to begin our discussion and get some initial thoughts from our panelists. So I ask our panelists to turn their cameras back on again, and hopefully we can replicate another lively conversation on this topic. So I wanted to get your thoughts, and I wanted to start with Ricky. I know Ricky is back on camera now, but I would like to get your thoughts about the using of age norm scores. When is it the right time to do it? When may not be the right time? I would really like to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, sure. And I think it's a really fascinating question. And when we were having our pre-discussion, we also talked about how it may be different when you are thinking about children versus the other age range in which it's often important, which is the elderly. And I think, it strikes me that there are really genuine and very important age-related differences in what patients want, need, or expect from treatment, and that this could also vary based on what the treatment is. So is it a disease-modifying treatment, or is it a treatment that's helping to control symptoms and so forth? So there can really be these profound age-related aspects to the context of use, or there could be none. And so, I think we have to think about that and what the implications are for that, and what the relevance is to the particular treatment trial that you're planning. I also think that what you are norming against could be crucial. So if you're norming against the general population, you're assessing where an individual or group of individuals sits compared to a group of the general population, which includes people who are healthy and includes people who have all kinds of other morbidities, versus norming against the population of other people who have the same health condition. And so thinking about the ramifications of those decisions of why are you norming? What are you trying to get at? But also, what do you want to compare to? And I think, again, when you think about the extremes of age norming might be really important to do for some types of age groups and not for others. And I think when I think about the difference between a child who has just turned 3 versus one who's about to turn 4, that might be large enough to where that year-based age grouping isn't going to really get me what I need in terms of understanding what is happening with the individual patients or the group of patients within a clinical trial. And then I think the same is true at the other end of the spectrum. I think as people age into extreme age, again, 1 year might not be as meaningful as 6 months or some other interval.
Thank you, Ricky, for that. So Robin, we've decided to take something that's used primarily in clinical practice that's informative, and that opportunity and that scale that we've chosen has potentially a way to help with interpretation, use of age norm scores. What is your perspectives of that from the industry when you're having to make a selection to support our endpoints, and really reflecting on the considerations that Marion has said?
Yeah, I think it's a tough situation because this particular type of scoring, Marion did such a nice job of distilling a complex concept in 10 minutes. I've never seen anything so so simplified and making so much sense. So thank you, especially late on a Friday. But that's hard to do. And so I think one of the main challenges that we think about is, as you said, will it help with the interpretation of the data? And I think more data is better than less, right? And so the likelihood is we are going to have to look at the raw scores, if there's a transform scoring algorithm, and the age scored normed scores, because it gives us better context for the interpretation. And the likelihood is that age norm might also make it challenging to interpret. We've heard a few case examples where that's the case, where it could actually dilute the treatment benefit depending on the length of our trial, depending on the age of the population, the change that is expected based on typical developmental milestones. So I think it could, it will give us additional thought. But I liked one of the things we had talked about in the prep calls, where maybe it's not your primary endpoint, but it's additional data that helps interpret and could be a secondary or exploratory, unless you're using it to define an endpoint in a different way, like a time to event or something of that nature. I also think the one thing I want to reflect on is, again, and I mentioned this before, when we create evidence around a new investigational treatment focused on outcomes that matter to patients, we're thinking about all those different stakeholders and how they will understand, interpret, and then communicate it, right? And that communication piece gets really challenging the more complicated our scoring becomes. We have that challenge now with new instruments, composite endpoints, IRT scoring. Things that have been around and used pretty widely are often challenging for particularly clinicians and patients and caregivers to wrap their head around. in one sense, I do think age norm scoring could help with clinicians who are used to thinking about it in that way. But I also do worry about the complexity and their ability to really make sense of that in the context of their own population, as well as patients and caregivers. Does it matter? And I'm putting on my parent hat at the moment. I have a 10-year-old son, and I think he's well on his way with the developmental milestones as expected. But if he were suffering from a rare chronic, illness, I don't know that I would care. In fact, it might make me feel worse to know that he wasn't, up to the normative. And what decision would I make? I don't know that would change my decision about a treatment if I'm seeing improvement in an individual level. And that would be what's important to me.
Thank you, Robin. Bryce, do you have some thoughts?
Yeah, thank you so much. Very exciting topic. I'm more excited even at the end of today. I'm geeking out on numbers. Great conversation, and I also echo Marion did a fantastic job showing some of the pitfalls of using the potential of age norm scores in clinical trial settings. For me, norm-based scoring or age-based scoring is really purely a descriptive system, which tells you where this either individual or group is relative to some group. And our discussion today is a particular age, but it could also be like a grade level or some other population as well. And because of that, as Marion pointed out, it has the challenges for many reasons, especially if your sample includes kids that go across age ranges or transition over time. So where the focus in clinical trials is looking at group change over time, if you use those age norm scores there, again, Marion pointed out some of the pitfalls of doing that. The best thing, at least in my perspective, in terms of use of these interpretive or descriptive type of scoring system, there is to, when you look at treatment effect, use either the raw scores of some kind of standardized scores where everyone's included to look at group change overall. And then if you want to see where that group ended up at or the change there, then maybe you want, as a descriptive purpose there, look at how that compares when you use the age norm scores overall. This is in parallel in many ways to what's in patient-focused drug development guidance number 4 when talking about providing score interpretation using meaningful score regions there, where you look at the effect of the treatment there, but you can translate the scores in terms of, in this example here, of the age-based norms. So I think there is some value, but it's rarely a descriptive system. The other thing I want to point out is some other concerns that may come up as well is when you use age-based norms is thinking about who exactly was in the normative group. And for some type of measures there, especially if you narrow it down to specific ages there, those that participated from the norm group may be a very small group there that might not be representative of the population. So those are some of the concerns themselves. The other issue, and Robin made this point as well, is the outcome of interest. If we try to apply it in our target population to the general population or typically developing kids, are they the same outcome and are they relevant? So as an example, we're working with the FDA to develop measures of communication ability in children with neurodevelopmental disorders with profound impacts on their cognition, their motility, and communication, which is what we're looking at. And for a lot of these populations that we're assessing there, they are primarily nonverbal and they communicate through other types of modalities, including gestures, use of devices, utterances, vocalizations, and things like that. And so for us, the question is, if we're trying to compare this group of children with neurodevelopmental disorders to a typically developing children overall, well, I'm not quite convinced the outcome's actually even equivalent. So communication in typically developing children is very different from communication for these particular populations, where for parents of typically developing children, they're focused on reconfirming and improving that child's verbalizations and talk there, where for these other populations, they're focused on other ways for that child to communicate. So the outcome itself may be very different and limit your ability to make those types of comparisons. And then secondly, Robin got this issue is, many ways, we're trying to look at improvements in a very profoundly impacted population who are typically at the fore of typically developing children. So we might see great improvements there, but when you compare those kids versus typically developing kids, they might be far off. And is that really helpful and important for the parents? And it's split on that particular decision there. So all those things raise some concerns about the system. There is a place for it as a descriptive system, but not really is best for looking at change over time. There are other types of psychometric ways if you want to make those comparisons there. One example is vertical scaling, where you can actually have everyone on the same metric for the same outcome, and you can have different reference points along your metric there that does make those types of comparisons. So that could be an alternate option other than doing the age-based norms.
Thank you, Bryce, for that. That was a lot of really great information. And really, I liked how you try to tie it back to, you know, number one, the PFDD guidance series, but also some of this reality of like, here's what maybe it's not the best plan. We really need to think about this in a thoughtful way. And I appreciate you highlighting the aspect of where, you know, we may be working with populations, and it kind of highlights Robin's point about if I have someone who is does not want to be compared on a normal developmental age norm scale approach, but what are those things to think about? How do we handle it when we're in that disease space where we don't have the age norms, quote unquote, but we have still valuable information that we need to figure out what is this experience of these scores in this content area for this disease? Because while there's heterogeneity in the disease, there is enough experience of the content area to give us a good range of where could be really be seeing things in that specific disease. So I really appreciate that tie-in. Cheryl, I'm gonna turn it over to you real quick and get your thoughts on this.
Yeah, so it's hard to go after Bryce because he really summarized it very succinctly with a lot of good actions and alternatives there. When I'm thinking about this topic, I think we're kind of drilling down to a topic that comes out of the earlier topic about using scales that were developed for clinical practice or clinical care. And there are really good reasons to have this age norm scoring system in that setting. This is a different setting, and it's okay to not use that same scoring algorithm. And so we've got to go back to what is our intention? Why are we doing this? And then what are the implications, which Marianne very clearly laid out. So what could we do instead? First, this is working with the developer of the instrument and making sure that they're open to an alternative scoring algorithm. Here is why, and here's what we're going to do about that. If we do just sort of regular scoring without the norming, this could be handled on the statistical side when the analysis is being done, and Marianne can chime in with more specific ways of doing this, but you know, it can be a covariate in the regression model where you've got age in there and you're adjusting for that statistically. It could also be exploratory endpoints where you're doing subgroup analysis or cohort analysis where the groups that should have that kind of common norming, look at them individually. This, of course, gets really complex if we're talking about a rare condition where our sample is already small to begin with. But when I think about this topic, I actually think the more complex side is having an instrument that's appropriate across ages as they develop, because you might actually need different items and different questions depending on the age. And I think Bryce kind of got into that. That's where we have to link the scores together. So we could have two different groups of people getting different items. As long as we've got some sort of common ground between those data points, we can link them together, put them on the same scale, and interpret them all on that same continuum. And I really like what Bryce said about how this idea of where are these scores in relation to what we're trying to compare them to, maybe a general population or kids their age or other kids with this condition or elders, whatever, wherever we're at. It's on the late end of all of that. So you're doing the scoring, you're doing your statistical analysis, and now you've got to interpret the data coming out. We can do that there without having to do the norming on the front end.
Well, thank you, Cheryl. So listening to this conversation and seeing some questions that are coming in, and then really something I want to get into that we haven't really talked a little bit about, much today, or the term hasn't been said, I don't think often enough today, is so how do we think about, when we are looking at scoring a COA that may have an option for age norm scores, we have to determine what is the right score really to use. Should I be using an alternative type scoring such as, or maybe a raw score, or if there's a standard score? Should we be comparing the scores to developmental age or chronological age? But the underpinning of all that and how we need to select is clinical meaningfulness with that interpretation. And when we've implemented that clinical outcome assessment that offers an age norm option, how do we layer and think about tying in? Because we've talked about all the other things, the qualitative stuff, the psychometric stuff, but now we got into this, okay, what is going to be clinically meaningful that we can interpret that a change that we have detected meets the standards of clinical meaningfulness, and what is actually the right way and maybe the right score to really be thinking about, or what are our options, perhaps is the better point to, I think what Cheryl was alluding to is how can I maximize maybe my endpoint hierarchy with different score potentials to use to build the evidence to support meaningful change. So I really want to get your thoughts on that, because that's a question that's been coming up about what about using raw scores or other types of scores, but we also have to tie it back to clinical benefit and meaningful change in the end when we want to interpret this. So I kind of want to ask this question. It may end up being a pretty lengthy discussion, and I think that's okay. But I do think that is kind of the discussion we're seeing. I think it's the questions that we're being asked right now in programs where, particularly in our rare disease space, we're being asked these questions left and right. We're providing advice on this. And so I really want to get everyone's perspective. I'm going to end with Marion so she can think about what we're thinking is. I'm going to start, I'll give everyone a heads up. I'm going to start with Ricky, and then can I go to Cheryl, then Bryce, and then Robin, and then we'll end with Marion on this question. So Ricky, can you start us off?
Yeah, sure. And I think when you were asking that question, the first thought I had is, one of the things that I think is often muddy in our work and needs to be a lot clearer is what's the difference between a meaningful change in a patient's experience and a meaningful change in score. And the example that I would give is that there are conditions where not changing your score is a meaningful change in your patient experience, or worsening more slowly is a meaningful change in patient experience. And, I'd like to see us all do a much better job from soup to nuts in measure development and evaluation of sort of tracking and understanding and documenting what makes something meaningful for patients, and what a meaningful change in score is, and how those two things are related. So, again, when you think about progressive illnesses, people are often going to be happy to stay where they are for many years, or to worsen more slowly. But the way that we think about developing measures and evaluating them psychometrically, even evaluating them qualitatively, we're often not considering that as a possibility, and don't necessarily have the same sort of robust science around how to understand and interpret it and work with it. And then I think, and I think we've all alluded to this, that even when there is change that is improvement, which is always what we hope for in a treatment, the meaningfulness of an interval of change might be different from age group to age group, and having that conversation, investigating that scientifically is important for understanding when age norming might be useful and when it might just be misleading or confusing or extraneous or just sort of noise around the signal that we are trying to find.
Thank you, Ricky. So Cheryl, do you have some thoughts on this?
My on the actual establishing how much change is meaningful, I think that the earlier session about embedded interviews really made that more concrete than sometimes it is as a psychometrician, where I'm just crunching some numbers and I get a number out of that, and that's the magical number. And I would point back to that session in terms of making sure that the meaningful change is actually can be communicated and interpreted by the humans that need to understand what it means. And to get there, I have to say, just when I think, Michelle, your question, scoring was embedded in there. And I think scoring is often, as a psychometrician, again, I can just run an IRT model and get some numbers out of it and magically have a scoring algorithm. But are the scores on a scale that are easy to communicate to people that are not psychometricians? And that is something that everybody should be thinking about as we're deciding what our scoring algorithm should be. It might be where a simple average across items is sufficient and it's precise enough, and you're not losing weighting that really needs to be incorporated in there. In that case, you can actually see what those response scales are and really think, okay, a 3.5, this person is somebody somewhere between 3 and 4 on average on this response scale, and it ties it. So I would just say, when we're thinking about establishing how much change is meaningful on the back end, on the front end, we have to think about, are we scoring this in a way that's going to make that easiest for not only the people running those analyses, but the people that ultimately are trying to communicate that to stakeholders and patients themselves, making sure that they can then take that information and decide, yes, this therapy is something that I want to try because this is a number that is something I want to be able to look forward to in my life.
Thank you for that, Cheryl. Bryce, some additional thoughts. I have a feeling that you and Cheryl will be very much aligned with your thinking, but I definitely want to hear your perspective, because I do know you have a significant background in pediatric development, including rare and non-rare diseases, and have faced, I know you are facing this right now.
Yeah, no, 100% correct there. And Ricky and Cheryl did an awesome job of setting my particular point there, which is that a number in itself is vague and uninformative overall there. And as Cheryl was saying, if you were to tell, again, I work with children with neurodevelopmental disorders, and if we're able to tell these parents, like, oh, you're if your child took this drug there, likely they could move from a 40 to a 50 or 50 to a 55. And if all they know is a higher score is good, they don't know how excited they should be, or if that's actually going to make a transformation in their lives and their child's lives overall there. And I think, this conversation about age-based norms, I don't think that's going to really help out that much for them to help understand exactly how this drug might help this particular child overall, to know how far they are from a first grader or second grader and third grader. What we need to do, to Cheryl's point there, is be able to tie these numbers, a 45 or 400, whatever the system is there, is tie those to actual behaviors for which their child can do. What we hear from our parents that we work with there is, we hear things, I want to know if my child can make a choice on what they want to watch for TV. I want my child to be able to tell me if they are in pain, if they're scared. I want them to be able to tell a joke, when they're having fun, when they're not having fun overall there. So we have the ability, using some of the tools that we use there for different parts of the score metric, is to tie the number to what a child at that score is able to do in terms of making choices or asking complex questions or telling their parents about pain there. And the extent that we can start tying those things there helps us to understand what may be meaningful or not meaningful in terms of changes in those families' daily activities.
Thank you, Bryce, for that. I really like how you said a number is just a number. It means we have no meaning for it unless we have a context around it. And what does that mean? So I really appreciate that. Robin, I want to turn to you, and I'm going to, because I hope you're flexible with what I'm about to add to you. I know we've been probably highlighting a little bit more here on the pediatric side, which is important, but I'm hoping you can think about, as you give me your response from the industry perspective, is the whole human lifespan, right? So we can face these same challenges when we're in our older adult with degenerative disease such as Alzheimer's, advanced Parkinson's, dementia with Lewy body. We run into some of these similar things of how to evaluate, because we often are using scales that are meant for adults, right? With this similar thing. So I'm hoping you can maybe incorporate a little bit the broader age span of some of this in your response. But I really, what is your thoughts as you're thinking about this when you have to start having this conversation with your clinical team about how are we going to measure this, and how do we need to write a dossier, or how should we think about endpoint hierarchy, and what scores can we create?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's not easy by any means. I think there's so many unanswered questions, whether we're talking about pediatrics or, more advanced aging conditions, especially in those degenerative areas. One of the areas we've actually been thinking a lot about lately, and Ricky started to hint at this, is, sometimes it's not just about improvement. Sometimes it's about maintaining a certain health state or not worsening. And I love the thinking here about potentially using age norm scores to understand the trajectory, right, of an individual. But I do think it does complicate things quite significantly when you then want to layer on what's meaningful, particularly at the individual level, because the point of age normed is to give us that reference point with a population, right? And so when we think about the individual, usually when we're talking meaningful change, all of the esteemed panelists have noted, it's really about their own personal experience. And so it's often hard to translate that in these very rare conditions often, and degenerative areas that will work for everyone. But what we have been leaning into is that carer experience, the caregiver experience, the patient experience when it's able to be solicited, such as we've talked about in the embedded interviews, or the qualitative, to get a sense at how does that change translate into change in functioning, more so in the elderly populations, aging populations. As Bryce said, in children, it's often behavior. We also see behaviors in the neurodegenerative as well: irritation, agitation, things that are expressing things are not going as as an individual would like, and so they're trying to express themselves in different ways. So I think it really does complicate things. I do not have the answer by any means, but I think that we need to think about, when we identify, and I really love what Cheryl said about upfront, before we get to how do we make sense of this, making sure that concept is relevant across the age ranges, wherever you're playing in that spectrum of age. And then, I saw a question in the chat thinking about maybe that concept is similar, but somewhat different, and we might need different measures across the age range. And then that also translates into different scoring and different meaningful change thresholds. And we can do that by designing a protocol that allows us to have the right anchors that are age appropriate, so that we can understand the differences, and designing embedded interviews as well, and really bringing in that caregiver experience, I think, is particularly important when we're dealing with these types of conditions. So it really is about the holistic data. And that's been our approach to date, because there isn't a one size fits all or one method today that allows us to really understand that context, because we need all of that to make sense of it. And then, different pieces are appropriate for different audiences when we do the communication aspects and translate that into their decision making.
Thank you, Robin, for that. So Marianne, I'm going to ask you to kind of give a little bit of a final thought, so our audience knows. We're going to get Marianne's thoughts, and then we're going to go do a wrap up, and I want to get our panelists last quick 1 minute final thoughts on actually the entire overall panel if they choose. But Marianne, you and I are reviewers, and we have to provide advice every day on our submissions. And one of our common questions that we have to think about is, what is the right score? What is the right way to create that endpoint, right? That will support, that we are hopeful will support overall efficacy, and that we can interpret and ultimately be able to describe into labeling if we can. So I would really hope you could provide some of your thoughts as that reviewer, that this is our everyday of what we sit down and think about when we're providing advice.
Sure. Thank you, Michelle. So I would start by saying that you should talk to the division before finalizing an endpoint or any other parts of your protocol that utilize age normed scores or age varying measures of any kind, and really discuss that with the division prior to starting the trial. In general, as we and others have said before, age norm scores, anything non-age norm scores are really the best choice of all the ones that you have out there in terms of looking at efficacy and whether what's happening to patients in a trial. Are they improving? Are they declining? And that's going to really come before you start communicating results to patients and caregivers, right? And their healthcare providers. You have to first figure out what the drug is doing, and I think that's really critical. Again, all scores have pros and cons. I think sponsors need to think really carefully about why they want to use age norm scores and think about the context of use. And I know there was mention of growth scale values. So growth scale values, that's a whole nother topic, and we could talk about it for a really long time. So maybe we'll save that for another time.
Thank you, Marion. Yes, that is a great topic, but I think I really appreciate your point that for right now, in what we're seeing and what we're thinking about, a raw score is maybe really provides us with some best opportunities to really leverage and interpret. But again, the emphasized point is that when we're considering any type of scoring approach, please do make sure you're having these conversations with the respective review division about your development program, about what makes sense and what are things that need to be done, things that additional evidence you may need to support your approach to your scoring. The earlier we can have that conversations, the more informative we can provide in trying to optimize, really that clinical trial design in your study protocol. So definitely come and have those conversations with us. We are very much aware of those conversations, and we have a lot more thoughts on this that we can't get out today, unfortunately. But we're willing to have those conversations, and I would say, even if you have a novel idea, do come talk to us about that so we can hear what it is and have that understanding. So to wrap up, I want to go around really quickly. So like I said, no more than 2 minutes max. Hopefully a quick 1 minute. What are your final thoughts overall on this panel? And I'll even explore if you have final thoughts on the overall day, because I think we had a really dynamic conversation, particularly our afternoon, with really getting into the nitty gritty and into the weeds on specific examples of collecting patient experience data. So Ricky, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, the real takeaway from today, and I'm a little bit biased because I am a qualitative researcher primarily, is that engaging with patients as you decide how you're going to develop treatments, as well as engaging in the kind of systematic scientific investigation of patients' experiences and their understanding and interactions with measures, is such a critical foundation for everything we do. And I think that, in this panel, we've seen kind of two very different methodological problems, where anchoring back every decision that you've made and every aspect of your rationale for doing what you're doing is so important. And ultimately that comes from patients as well as from labs and from clinical understanding. And, ultimately trial measurement, it's an exercise in trying to understand how a treatment affects people. And if you kind of try to start with the cart instead of the horse, I think that you often wind up having problems that are thornier and more difficult to unravel than if you did, start with the horse and then have it pull the cart of what the measurement should be and how the scoring should happen, and whether you should, we can go into not just age norming, but there's all kinds of other specific methodological problems that crop up in specific populations and specific diseases. So really doing that high quality work and leveraging it from the beginning, and talking to the FDA early and often, I think need to be the big takeaways from today.
Thank you, Ricky. Bryce, your final thoughts?
Yeah, no, thank you very much. It's been such a wonderful day, and I do agree with Ricky. The patient engagement has been the sort of key linking cross-cutting theme throughout of today, and importantly, what I really loved about today is it highlighted a whole bunch of different methodologies, and recognizing that not one single method is always the gold standard for every single case. And it's important for any researcher or investigator, including the patients, including the FDA, to figure out is what may be the best approach. What's your rationale for choosing that particular method? And recognizing that there might be multiple ways to capture the same thing overall. I'm a huge advocate for both qualitative and quantitative methods and mixing those things together. My analogy I love to use is the quantitative sort of allows you to connect point A to point B and point C in sort of a simple black and white type of diagram. The qualitative gives the color around each of those points to help understand how these disease and treatments are impacting patients overall. So I'm a huge advocate for these things, and hopefully this conversation today has helped stimulate a lot of new ideas about moving forward.
Great, thank you, Bryce. Cheryl?
Yeah, I want to thank the FDA for holding this workshop today, because the theme that I took out from it is there's flexibility. We have options. It's not one size fits all. The PFDD guidance series is such a useful foundation for us to start with, but within there we have options, and we're not being told do this, don't do that. What I really heard today is there are people that are doing this thing, and here are some things that we need to be thinking about if you choose that path. If you don't choose that path, there are other paths that you can choose. But no matter what path we're choosing, we have to do it with an informed group of people who are bringing the experts to the table, who really understand the evidence that needs to be generated or needs to be sifted through. And with that intention, that word that keeps coming up, what is the intention behind using the method that we've chosen? And is it really going to fit the purpose for what it is that we're trying to measure or trying to achieve with the evidence generation that we're doing? So this is really exciting to see the open door for flexibility, and also knowing that that invite is always there to engage early, engage often, and make sure that we are on that right path, that we have those opportunities to check and then take a different path if it's not the one that we should be on.
Thank you, Cheryl. Robin?
Yeah, I completely agree. Be intentional is what really stuck out for me, and that it needs to be a thoughtful approach, starting first with patients, but then involving multi-stakeholders, inclusive of the FDA and other regulators, to think about how that approach makes sense and will generate the high, robust data that we need for decision making. And in that engagement, recognizing that we need to be transparent, open, provide rationale for our decision making, not assume that you have necessarily all of the answers, but that your guidance is really quite thoughtful and intended to really work together as partners to get this right. And I think that's so important, particularly for sponsors to recognize. And then I think what I really loved about this panel in particular is that it started to get, we've come so far that we're even beginning to think beyond the trials and that intersection between trials and practice, because a patient doesn't just enroll in a study and then move on, and often very not cured, right? We hope that's the case, but that's very rare. They continue to go on and live their lives and have to make continuous decisions and change course with treatment options and navigate through complex healthcare choices. And I think we have a real responsibility as a collective group to make sure that they have the right information, not only in trials, first hurdle, but in that clinical practice world. And if we get this right and engage them early and throughout, we can create measures that will enable us to really deliver on that promise that I see a label being, right? It's a promise of what we think can happen, but the real world is messy. We need to continuously track that, monitor, and help them change course in the real world as well. So I really hope in the future we can do more of that proactively and take what we do in trials and apply it in the real world.
Thank you, Robin. And Marion, any final words?
Yes, thank you. I'd like to thank everyone online for joining today's workshop. I thought the panel discussions today, and also, specifically the one that we just had, that I think were really, really rich and informative, really great insights. I think there's clearly many additional methodologic approaches that warrant exploration. I'll leave it with that.
Thank you, Marion. I want to thank my panelists. I want to thank everyone online for your participation. It was such a great panel today. I am now going to turn it over to my colleague, Ethan, for final remarks. So Ethan.
Thank you once again to all our panel members and presenters for just having such a strong concluding session. We will now be hearing closing remarks from Ms. Robin Bent. So Ms. Bent, please go ahead.
Thanks, Ethan, and thanks everyone for sticking with us through this day. I think that this was an amazing series of discussions, and really appreciate everybody sticking with us. Particularly wanted to thank Ethan for moderating, for all of our panelists, moderators, and presenters. Obviously, the audience for sticking with us, the planning committee, Marcus and Sheldon, our AV techs, who kept us running smoothly. We were not able, obviously, to get through everybody's really great questions. Unfortunately, we ran out of time, but please know that those questions do not go into a trash bucket. They go into, we will keep them, and they will definitely inform potentially some of our frequently asked questions or other ways that we communicate. Slides and recording will be posted within the next week or so. And again, thank you so much. We look forward to our next meeting, which will be taking place in within the next year. And so with that, I just wish everybody a great night and a wonderful weekend. Thank you.